Benchmark, the voice of business. Presented by LMD.
On this edition of Benchmark, first up, former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs Jayantha Dhanapala casts a critical eye on the state of the nation. Then, LMD columnist Samantha Amerasinghe gives us her predictions for Sri Lanka's economy in 2013. And finally, we discuss the latest BCI data with Nielsen's Managing Director Shaheen Cader. That's the lineup for Benchmark.
Hello and a Happy New Year from all of us at Benchmark. I'm Savitri Rodrigo. As is customary, our first guest for the year is former UN Under-Secretary General for Disarmament Affairs, Jayantha Dhanapala. In fact, this former senior diplomat is also the president of Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs and member of the Friday Forum chapter in Sri Lanka as well. Now, he's here in our studios to discuss a wide range of issues and subjects on Benchmark today. Looking back from your perspective on the year that was, in terms of progress.
The economy continues to grow, although not as well as it did in 2011. We had some problems caused by the depreciation of the rupee. We had other problems because of a surge in imports and because of our growing foreign debt. But nevertheless, there was still a growth rate which is over 5%. We don't know yet what the final figure will be. There has been some progress with regard to resettlement of the IDPs, leaving only a small percentage of people not yet resettled. We've had some progress in the sports field. We came runners-up in the T20. I mean, it's not as good as winning outright, but our team, ably led by Mahela Jayawardena, brought us to the final, which I think is commendable. But on the negative side, I think while there has been some development, we must acknowledge that the country's image suffered a serious blow in March of last year when the Human Rights Council, the premier human rights forum in the UN system, had a resolution which was in fact seen as a negative resolution in terms of the government, because the government fought hard to defeat it and lost. That will have repercussions because although it very simply asked the government to implement its own Presidential Commission report, the LLRC report, it will come up again in March of 2013, and then we will have a serious problem to answer. The second major setback is the way in which the impeachment of the Chief Justice was conducted. The causes of it seemed very clearly to be vindictive because of the judgment on the Divi Naguma bill. There was also procedurally many flaws because there was a arrogation of the rights of the judiciary by the legislature, when the separation of powers, as we know, is a sine qua non in any democracy. And there was also the disgraceful conduct of the government members of the Select Committee. It will be a long time before we can erase that blemish on our democratic record, whatever the motives of the government may have been. And it will also seriously put into question our continuance with regard to our Commonwealth membership, the holding of the Commonwealth Summit, which is scheduled for this year, the Queen's attendance at it, and so on. And of course, finally, it is the mounting focus on prestige projects, projects in Hambantota and projects elsewhere, and a tremendous amount of wastage, which some people estimate at 2 to 3% of the GDP in all these public sector expenditure, which of course could be used for helping the poor, because although we are a middle income country, there are a number of weaker sections of our society who desperately need help. And the way in which we have splashed money on importing Lamborghinis for night races in Colombo, which only satisfies the wishes of a very small minority, whereas everybody complains about the contrast between Lamborghini and Badagini. I think that kind of contrast will cause very serious social tensions in the future, and we have to be very careful.
So, the new year, what are your expectations for 2013?
My expectations will be that far too late, but nevertheless never too late, the President will begin to address the issue of a political solution to the ethnic problem. It is over 3.5 years since we achieved the military victory over the LTTE, and that was a huge relief to the people of Sri Lanka after 30 decades of conflict. And a most brutal terrorist group was eliminated. But the people of Jaffna and the eastern province, both the Tamils and the Muslims, and the Sinhalese in parts of those areas, require a solution to the problem. And the LLRC recommended that there should be some kind of devolution of power. Now, precisely what kind of devolution that will be has not been spelled out. That is something which all the parties must agree on. The President, in his wisdom, has suggested a parliamentary select committee. But seeing the very, very sharp differences on this issue, and seeing the fact that some are already calling for the repeal of the 13th Amendment, what is the substitute for that? There has to be some measure of power sharing so that the minorities feel that they have a place in this country. At the moment, they don't. And there is a deep sense of insecurity, particularly in the north and the south. The events at the University of Jaffna last year, the events in other parts of the country where Tamils still feel that they are being discriminated against, do not give them a sense of security, do not give them a sense that they have the same rights as any other citizen in Sri Lanka.
How about law and order? Where do we stand at this point?
Well, the situation is a dismal one because beginning with the attack on the judiciary, which was not an isolated case, we've had a number of situations where people with powerful connections with the government have obviously got off scot-free. There was a case a year ago of a British tourist being killed somewhere in Tangala, and a local politician was involved. There is still no indication that that person has been prosecuted or in any way convicted. Numerous other cases. The case of Bhartalal Premachanda remains unsettled. His daughter and his wife have repeatedly brought this attention to the media, but in the courts we still await what the Attorney General's advice is going to be, and it's been more than a year since this dreadful murder took place. We've had other convicted murderers being pardoned, and we have the ludicrous situation of the army commander who helped to win the war after 30 years, now being given a pardon but still stripped of his civil rights and of all his military honors, whereas Pillayan and Karuna and KP are enjoying the fruits of all the government favors. So this kind of dichotomy makes it very obvious to the average citizen that the rule of law is very unevenly and discriminately applied.
We will be talking once more after a commercial break, so time for that. And when we return, Jayantha Dhanapala speaks on corruption, Sri Lanka's regional status and global affairs. So stay with us.
When we entered the industry in 1995, a new star was born as a fully owned subsidiary of People's Bank. For those seeking to grow their businesses, PLC provided the seed. We are not only Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company, but also the largest non-banking financial institution. Welcome to a new dawn for the nation. Introducing People's Leasing and Finance, PLC.
Welcome back to Benchmark, and we now continue our discussion with our very special guest, Jayantha Dhanapala. Looking at the depleting or depreciating status of law and order, do you think there are any practical solutions that could be implemented, or are we just too far gone and spun out of control?
No, there are a number of things that have got to be done. I think we have got to strengthen law enforcement agencies. First and foremost, it is a completely wrong thing for the police to be under the Ministry of Defense. In most civilized countries, the police comes under the Home Ministry, and it's not a defense function. So we must educate our police, we must raise the standard of our law enforcement to ensure that our police functions as they should, and that they will not have any political interference in the performance of their duties. That confidence must be given to each and every police constable, so that when he arrests a wrongdoer, he knows that through the back door, that wrongdoer will not be allowed to escape. So that's the first thing that has to be done. I think the spate of crimes, particularly crimes against women, have been horrendous. You may have recalled that in India, when there was a gang rape in Delhi of a 23-year-old woman, there was a huge outpouring of protest by the public. There were demonstrations for days in Delhi. Now, our people also must be able to protest whenever there is a failure on the part of the authorities to ensure that the rule of law prevails. Public interest litigation is one way of doing it, but also pressure, political pressure on the government to ensure that the rule of law prevails is vital, because we are a democracy. We still have numerous liberties available to us. I'm afraid the state-owned media has been, in my opinion, a disgrace, because we had a very, very vibrant press in the past with some outstanding journalists. But today, the number of outstanding journalists can be counted on the fingers of one hand. And that's very, very sad. And to see journalists who are obviously lackeys of the government, I think is a great disgrace to the journalist profession.
In an overall context, how do we match up to Malaysia and Singapore, the model nations in Asia? Can we get there? Can we become them at some stage, and if so, how long?
I think Singapore is the model in terms of being corruption-free. And Singapore has a very almost a moralistic approach to the question of corruption. They pay their public servants very well, and that ensures that nobody is tempted by the bribe or by the additional commission that may come with the various projects that are engaged in. If we can also adopt that kind of approach, there was a time when Singapore came to Sri Lanka to learn about our anti-corruption laws and our anti-corruption mechanisms. And it's an irony that they should be so far ahead in terms of clean government than we are. So we have a lot to learn about the implementation of our laws. We talk a lot about what we have achieved in the 60 odd years of our independence. But we really have got good laws on the statute books, but we do not implement them. So that is very true. And as our economy expands and as more development projects, we know that a lot of these projects are being given to the private sector because there is an opportunity of making commissions, whereas some of our own government departments can do some of this. For example, in the railway, we could have done some of those development projects instead of giving it to the foreign companies to do it. But there is then less of an opportunity of making commissions, and that, I think, is something that must be eliminated.
From an economic and social point of view, how far behind Malaysia and Singapore are we?
Well, we have, I think, got, in terms of Singapore, greater democratic liberties than Singapore has. And as you know, Singapore has been a one-party state for a long time. We may be getting there in terms of having a one-party state, because of the weakness of the opposition and because of the arrogance of power of the government. So that is not something that we want to emulate Singapore on. But in terms of its economic development and its priorities, going in for a service economy, knowing the limitations of Singapore as a city-state, Malaysia has great advantages because it has enormous resources in terms of its tin, its mineral resources, and the other resources that it has, which we have not ourselves got, but which we could match if we really develop ourselves into having outsourcing of certain aspects of bigger economies like China and so on. Thailand has done that to a large extent. So the tiger economies of Southeast Asia have had a head start over us because they went into some of these service sectors much earlier than we did. We have still got to match that. Although we have the talent, we have the human resources for that, and that's extremely encouraging. But I think we need to also have the confidence that the right person is put in the right job, that people are not appointed because of their political connections, that we get investors who are there because they can genuinely service the needs of the country rather than being just contacts for the prevailing government and have paid the right commissions. So that has to be done in a way that we can then match the growth rates of Malaysia and of Singapore.
President Obama officially takes office next week, which is the 21st of January, and this, in your LMD column for January, you said that this gives him an opportunity, and I quote, to make a Lincoln-esque impact, unquote, on America. Can you just elaborate a little bit on what you actually meant?
Well, it was perhaps a hyperbole on my part, but I was making use of the fact that the 1st of January, 150 years ago, was the time when Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, declared the emancipation of all the slaves in the United States. And I'm convinced that the last presidential election between Romney and Obama was essentially a class war, that it was the middle class and the underclass of the American economy, which has been very hard hit by the Wall Street crisis, that those people, the minorities and the immigrants, have all had to pay a very heavy price, whereas the super rich have got away with it. As you know, there has been a deep resistance on the part of the Republican Party and the Tea Party in particular faction to any kind of increase in the taxes for the rich. And the fiscal cliff has been caused partly because they can't bridge the deficit. And there has to be a reform of the tax structure. So I think that Obama, if he stops compromising as he has done in the first 4 years of his presidency will be able to lift this economic underclass above the situation that they find themselves trapped in. If he goes on, as he did in the first 4 years of his tenure, with the business as usual, compromising, which is probably something that is drawn from his past as a community organizer, where you try to look for a consensus and you don't stand firmly behind your own principles, then I'm afraid the path is being opened for a declining America to finally go to the Republican Party once again with disastrous results for both the United States itself and for the global community. Already it has been predicted that by 2030 China will be the largest economy in the world. America may still have the largest military because of its huge military expenditure, but come 2014 they withdraw from Afghanistan, and for the first time in many, many years there will not be a country at war. Now there are a lot of pressures from the military industrial complex as well as from Israel for the United States to engage in a war with Iran because of its nuclear program. That would be a very major disaster. It would be a major mistake if Obama abandons the path of diplomacy. There have been indications that the Iranians are ready to talk, and they have already had talks with the IAEA in order to try to establish some kind of a dialogue. We also know that Ahmadinejad, the president, who has made extreme statements from time to time, let's face it, completes his term by August of this year, which means there will be a new president. And although the policies of Iran will not change fundamentally because the Supreme Ayatollah continues to call the shots, there will be, I think, room for diplomacy. And I think we need to seize that room. There will also be a great opportunity for Obama to solve the Middle East problem and to give the Palestinians what they richly deserve, and that is a state of their own. They were able last year to get their status in the UN upgraded because of the overwhelming support in the international community, which included Sri Lanka, which has been a consistent supporter of the Palestinian cause. But with Mr. Netanyahu as Prime Minister of Israel, continuing to pursue a very extremist position, a hardline position, it's going to be very difficult. And I think that's where Obama's leadership will be called into question.
That was a very interesting start to our new year. Thank you very much, Mr. Dhanapala. On the other side, we have Samantha Amerasinghe, economist and LMD columnist, and after her, Shaheen Cader, the managing director of Nielsen.
When we entered the industry in 1995, a new star was born as a fully owned subsidiary of People's Bank. For those seeking to grow their businesses, PLC provided the seed. We are not only Sri Lanka's #1 leasing company, but also the largest non-banking financial institution. Welcome to a new dawn for the nation. Introducing People's Leasing and Finance, PLC.
Welcome back to Benchmark. I'm Anushan Selvaraja, and with me now is LMD columnist and economist with Standard Chartered Bank, Samantha Amerasinghe. Now, Samantha, in your article in this month's issue of LMD, you say that Sri Lanka is on a stronger footing going into this year. Now, could you elaborate as to why you said so?
Well, 2012 was essentially a year of macro adjustment to address the imbalances in Sri Lanka's economy. The high credit growth, the widening trade deficit, the volatility we saw in the Sri Lankan rupee, as well as high inflation. So macro fundamentals as we begin 2013 seem to be much more on track. So we're expecting to see better prospects this year, particularly in the second half, as global growth gathers momentum. Inflation is expected to moderate, and the balance of payments surplus is also projected to increase. And we're expecting higher capital inflows with the uptick in global growth, as well as improved risk sentiment, which should compensate for the persistent weak demand for Sri Lanka's exports.
Now, would policy focus shift this year, and if so, in what ways and why?
In 2013, the policy focus is likely to shift to supporting growth from tackling high inflation and credit growth. And policymakers seem to have a renewed sense of urgency to focus on growth following the much lower than expected third quarter 2012 GDP print of 4.8%, which I believe was the lowest quarterly growth recorded since the third quarter of 2009. Which also led to the unexpected 25 basis points policy rate cut to 7.5% in December. We believe the central bank's move to cut rates is preemptive in nature, as inflation remains stubbornly high at 9.2% in December. And the risk is that premature easing of policy could fuel inflationary pressures. That said, we're expecting inflation to moderate in the second quarter of 2013 due to improved domestic supply, and we feel this should provide the central bank with sufficient flexibility to cut policy rates further.
Samantha, what would have to be done to ensure that the government achieves its growth targets for 2013?
It's imperative that the government remains resolute in its efforts to tackle the twin deficits, both trade and fiscal, and that it remains committed to fiscal consolidation and economic development. And in fact, in his 2013 budget speech, the finance minister stated that the fiscal deficit would be kept below 6% of GDP, while public investment would also remain at its current level of approximately 6% of GDP. And if these targets are met, we believe a GDP growth target of 7% should be achievable. But of course, further structural reforms will also be necessary to support the macro adjustments to achieve this growth target. And in this regard, there should be a greater focus on reforming state-owned enterprises. Finally, the economic environment should also be conducive to doing business. There should be policy predictability and consistency should also prevail at all times. And there should be transparency, law and order, and good governance, as this is what will attract investors and boost FDI inflows further.
What about our balance of payments? How is this going to fare this year?
The central bank is expecting the current account to narrow to 4.7% of GDP, and we think the trade balance is likely to remain in deficit as demand for investment goods increases to support growth. However, we're also expecting an improvement in the current account to around 4.5% of GDP in 2013 from an estimated 6.1% in 2012, as we believe exports will recover slightly. And this will be supported by robust remittance inflows and tourism receipts. And we're expecting the balance of payments as a result to improve further. The central bank has projected a balance of payments surplus of $510 million US this year, as capital inflows are expected to receive a boost with the uptick we're all expecting to see in global growth, as well as improved risk sentiment.
That was LMD columnist and economist with Standard Chartered Bank, Samantha Amerasinghe. After a short commercial break, Nishu Hashim speaks to Shaheen Cader, the Managing Director of Nielsen, for the latest on Business Confidence Index. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Benchmark. I'm Nishu Hashim, and with me now is Managing Director of Nielsen, Shaheen Cader, with the very latest on the Business Confidence Index. Now, Shaheen, the BCI has improved gradually but is still lower than what it was in December 2011. What are the factors affecting this slow movement, and is the business community being maybe too cautious?
Yeah, Nishu, I think first of all the Business Confidence Index came down drastically in 2012 due to the exchange rate devaluation and the hike in interest rates. And this actually impacted many companies' profitability. So that's really the source of the decline. Now we see it coming back, but gradually, as you say. And so therefore, we feel that unless there is a substantial reduction in interest rates or there's a jump in business volumes, the recovery is likely to be gradual rather than a surge.
How do respondents view the investment climate in the country?
Well, overall, I think the interest in making new investments is low. Only about 38% in the last survey feel that the investment climate is good or very good. A lot of this is due to actually consumer spending coming down. And so therefore, well, however, there is this 38% who feel optimistic. The reasons that they are optimistic is that they feel that economic growth will be strong in 2013 and therefore there would be opportunities for investment.
Shaheen, what would you say are the key stumbling blocks for our economic growth?
Well, I think there are two stumbling blocks really. Firstly, I think unfortunately Sri Lanka is really heavily dependent on the weather for our agricultural output. And in the past 2 years, we've seen droughts, we've seen floods, which has really impacted agricultural growth. So this is one stumbling block. The second stumbling block is, I think, internal trade, which is also a significant contributor to GDP growth. And we've really not seen a big improvement in internal trade to really have an impact on GDP growth in the last couple of quarters.
That was Managing Director of Nielsen, Shaheen Cader, wrapping up this edition of Benchmark. We hope you enjoyed the show and thank you for watching.